so much. John, it's a real delight to be here. I was saying beforehand, I've now been to all the Southern Baptist seminaries except for New Orleans. I haven't been there yet. But I'm a West Coaster. I just want to tell you that. I was born and raised in Salem, Oregon. So I kind of come back home, and we have 4 children, but 2 of our children are in Portland, and we have 7 grandkids there. So what am I still doing in Kentucky? I don't know. But it's great. I spent 6 years in Southern California. I did my PhD at Fuller, and then I taught in another century, literally, at Azusa Pacific University down the road here. So it's a delight to be here. I was excited to come here for, among other reasons, just to have some fellowship with you, to know, we're together in the same cause, together of spreading the good news about Jesus. So, what a wonderful thing to be with you and to see your beautiful grounds here. I know you've moved a few years ago, and I look forward to getting to know what God is doing among you guys. Another thing I want to say as I begin, yes, this is on Revelation, so just a little bit of background. I wrote kind of a popular commentary on Revelation, and if you know the ESV expository commentary series. So I wrote a commentary on Revelation in that series. And but there's so much to learn from Revelation. I felt like I just stuck my toe in a little bit. And then I've been invited in the last couple of years to do the Baker exegetical commentary of the New Testament, which I've done Romans in. I've been invited to do that volume in Revelation. So that's my next big project. If I live long enough, I've really just begun that. It's at a different level from my first one. So what I'm sharing with you is kind of a popular book. I'm really not trying, what am I doing here? I hope I don't disappoint you. I'm really, my goal in this book is I'm not advocating a new or radical thesis or trying to plow new ground with Revelation. What I'm sharing with you is what I think are kind of the mainstream teachings of the book that I think are for all Christians everywhere, for the Church of Jesus Christ. Now, my book is, right now it's a short book, 51,000 words, but there's no way I can do that in 4 days. So, I'll give an introduction today where we'll talk mainly about just a short introduction to the book, and then about the opponents to the gospel, the enemies of the gospel today. Then I have a chapter on perseverance, which I'm going to skip. It's so important, right? I feel guilty even saying that, but I am going to skip it for various reasons. One reason is it's a very long chapter. So then tomorrow I'm going to talk about God the Father, the role of God in Revelation. If I have time, we'll talk about the Holy Spirit as well one of these days. Then Wednesday, I'm going to talk about Jesus Christ. So as I said, very mainstream, right? And then I have a chapter on the new creation, but I'm leaning towards, on Thursday, I have a chapter on the millennium. So the only way I want to say by way of introduction is if you have a strong view of the millennium, I don't. And you will see. You will see when we come to it. So I'm going to argue a particular position, but I could imagine by the time I write the commentary, I might hold a different view. The joke I use at Southern Seminary is Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday, I'm all-mill. Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, I'm pre-mill. So there's some truth in that. Maybe I share that with you and you can help me, and you can instruct me. So here we go. Just a few introductory things. So when we read the book of Revelation, we're struck by the vagueness of the book. Put it up. Oh, it fell. Yeah. Yeah, sure. Thank you for saying that. We're struck by its vagueness in terms of the historical setting of the book. Despite the claims of scholars, there's nothing in the book which indisputably points to life under a particular emperor. You know, you can think of Nero, 54 to 68 AD. Some people put it there. You could put it with Domitian. That's the most popular view, 81 to 96 AD as an emperor. Or Trajan, 98 through 117, or even some other emperor. Obviously, the book was written at a particular time and addressed to churches in Asia Minor, but we lack definitive evidence, I'm saying from the book itself, for a specific date. I actually opt for the later date, so I'm not denying that there's a particular date. The point I'm making here is hermeneutical. No interpretation should be accepted which demands a particular date. So I think this is important hermeneutically, and that the imprecision of the historical situation, I think, is helpful. Interpretive views, for example, demanding that Revelation was written before AD 70 should be rejected. Any interpretation that requires, I would argue, a particular historical setting imposes constraints in reading that can't be verified. The lack of specificity in the book, at least from God's perspective, if we assume divine inspiration, I take it we do in here, I hope so, is instructive for us as well. We must avoid the rabbit hole of binding our view of Revelation to a particular historical reconstruction. And I say some more things about that. I'm going to skip that. I'm going to say a little bit now about the genre of the book, which is, I'm sure, familiar to you. I mean, the apocalyptic genre takes the pride of place. But at the same time in the book, we have 7 letters, don't we, in chapters 2 and 3. And John also speaks of the prophetic character of the book. So Revelation, in other words, is as a mixture of genres. You have epistolary literature, you have prophetic literature, you have apocalyptic literature. Richard Bauckham, if you know his books on Revelation, they are outstanding. This is what he says. Revelation is a literary work composed with astonishing care and skill. We should certainly not doubt that John had remarkable visionary experiences, but he has transmuted them through what must have been a lengthy process of reflection and writing into a thoroughly literary creation, which is designed not to reproduce the experience so much as to communicate the meaning of the revelation that had been given to him. When we think of the epistolary character of the book, it indicates that John addresses the situation and the experiences of his readers. And thus, the message of the book is tied. I'm not arguing there's no historical situation. It's tied to the historical situation of the 7 churches, even if we can't locate a particular date. But we learn something about those churches from these 7 letters, don't we? So we're reminded that Revelation wasn't written as a general tract about history, but was intended for the churches of Asia Minor in the 1st century, I think. Most would agree with that. The epistolary genre in the book reminds us that we should not indulge in what I call newspaper eschatology in reading the book. The book was written to readers who occupied a particular social location. And presumably they understood, at least mainly, what was written to them. And the hermeneutical significance of this is massively important, for it eliminates, probably no one in here holds this view, but it eliminates the popular conception that modern readers interpret Revelation better than the original readers. Those who propose such readings practice what I call newspaper eschatology. And they read the book in terms of current events. Actually, all who pay attention to these things, I've been a Christian for almost 50 years, we realize that such a hermeneutical approach is arbitrary since the interpretation changes as events transpire. The interpretation of the book, even if one adopted the approach of interpreting Revelation in accord with current events, is scarcely clear, since the interpretation of Revelation shifts over time. So, we have 7 letters. As well, I think there's indications in the letters that the 7 letters communicate to churches by way of application throughout history. So those letters speak to us today at a number of levels, including what I'd say about perseverance, but I'm not going to talk about that, as I already mentioned, except for in a glancing sort of way. So we have an epistle written to the situations. Revelation is also a prophecy. That's the chapter 1, verse 3. He identifies it as a prophecy. Actually, the references to Revelation being a prophecy are especially clustered at the end of the book in chapter 22. Chapter 22, verse 6, verse 7, verse 9, verse 10, verse 18, verse 19. All emphasize that the book is a prophecy, so that's quite interesting, isn't it? That he mentions this especially at the end. So that's a key to understanding the apocalypse. The oral recitation of Revelation. Remember, he says in 1:3, we ought to read it. The oral recitation of Revelation is a constitutive element of the church's worship, indicating that the words of the prophecy were considered to be authoritative. In fact, as you all know, at the end of the book, he threatens the readers about adding or subtracting, and of course that's very close to what Moses says in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 2 about his revelation. And that echo to the words of Moses indicates that John believes this book is the authoritative, contains authoritative words of God, just as authoritative as the Torah. John tells us in 22:6, as a prophecy, the book discloses what must soon take place. And at the very beginning of the book, and at the end, we're told 1:3 and 22:10, the time is near. So I'd love to reflect with you on that, but that's another thing I'm skipping, if you want to ask a question about that. I'm just skipping because of time. That's quite an interesting statement, that the time is near, and he's talking about what's take place soon, especially because we live 2,000 years later. What in the world does that mean? But the prophecy, of course, isn't written merely to convey information. The purpose of the book is ethical formation and transformation. Since genuine hearing, right, 1:3, 22:7, both referring to it as a prophecy, genuine hearing leads to obedience, to keeping the words of the prophecy. So one of my burdens about the book of Revelation, I preached through it. I'm not the preaching pastor now, but I was a preaching pastor in a church from 1998 through 2015, and I preached through Revelation, and I preached it because I felt the book is very practical for our people, theological and very practical. The prophetic vision has a pragmatic purpose, which is intended to shape the thinking and transform the behavior of the readers. We could say, picking up on Jeffrey DeWall Dryden's work, we could say that Revelation in that sense has a wisdom purpose. And I'm defining wisdom the way Dryden does, if you've read his book. By wisdom, it's intended to shape the character of the reader. So I'm not arguing, there's big debates today about what wisdom literature is, or even if it's distinguishable. I'm not getting into that debate. But that it has a general wisdom purpose. Also, Revelation, of course, is, although not everybody agrees with this, but is apocalyptic. And, Adela Yarborough Collins, John Collins, David Hellholm, David Ani, and so forth, they propose this definition. You've probably heard this definition if you've studied Revelation. Here it goes. This is available online, all kinds of places. Apocalypse is a genre of revelatory literature with a narrative framework in which a revelation is mediated by an otherworldly being, that's an angel, right, in Revelation, to a human recipient, that's John, disclosing a transcendent reality, right, which is both temporal insofar as it envisages eschatological salvation. So there's a linear story. It's a transcendent word from God, but it's a linear story, right? And it's spatial. There's the idea of transcendence again, right? Insofar as it involves another supernatural world. Apocalypse was intended to interpret present earthly circumstances in light of the supernatural world and of the future, and to influence both the understanding and the behavior of the audience by means of divine authority. So I think that's a very helpful definition, and those who wrote that definition spent a long time studying what apocalypses were. And again, the pragmatic and practical element comes out, doesn't it? Well, one thing Buchanan points out that is very interesting, he says Revelation differs from other apocalypses in that the visual imagery in the book exceeds what we see in other apocalypses. And we don't have the longer conversations in Revelation between the mediator of Revelation and the one who receives it. So, that's very interesting. And for me as an interpreter, sometimes I wish we had those conversations. Like, what does this mean? How about a nice conversation? But no, we didn't get that as much. So we have a narrative here. And the narrative rehearses the Lord's triumph over the forces of evil as he thinks about the end of history and the coming of the new heavens and the new earth. There's another little book out there by Leon Morris. It's an older book, but you can get a PDF of this book free online. It is amazing now. Because I had a copy, and I think I gave my son's a New Testament professor at Western Seminary up in Portland. One of my sons is up there, so I think I gave him my book, but I got it back, the book Apocalyptic by Leon Morris, because you can just download it as a PDF, which is so nice. And Morris mentions, in his book, here's some features of apocalyptic, historical dualism, the battle between God and Satan, not ontological dualism, right? But historical dualism, visions, of course we see that in Revelation, pseudonymity usually, but everybody agrees Revelation is an exception. So everybody agrees that Revelation is an exception, but they don't all agree who the author is. Because it just says John, right? I think it's John the Apostle, but not everybody agrees on that. But there is basically universal agreement. There's probably someone who disagrees, but there's virtually universal agreement that Revelation isn't pseudonymous. Then you have symbolism. Now the extent of the symbolism is very disputed. You have numerology. Of course, that's all over the place in Revelation, isn't it? Angelology. Angels play a huge role in the book, of course. Demonology. Satan and demons play a huge role in the book. And you have predicted woes. Of course, all those features are in Revelation. So the symbolism of Revelation is indisputable. We don't have to weary ourselves with listing all the examples. Vern Poythress, out at Westminster Seminary, says that in interpreting Revelation, we need to take into account 4 different levels. The linguistic level, what does he mean by the linguistic level? What John wrote, the words he wrote. The visionary level, those are the visions he received. So, you can think he saw beasts, right? He saw dragons. He saw lambs. Then thirdly, the referential level, where the historical referent of the vision is unpacked. So the first beast may refer to Rome, right? The lamb to Christ. And then the symbolical level where the meaning of the referent is conveyed. I actually think what Poythress says there can maybe a little too simplistic, but be collapsed maybe into two for simplicity. You have the visions and the referent, and then the meaning of the visions. So, right, a couple examples, they're not hard to understand. As the Son of Man, Jesus doesn't literally have a 2-edged sword in his mouth, does he? The sword, that's the vision, but the sword stands for the power and the efficacy of his word. So we unpack that symbol. Sometimes people say we ought to interpret Revelation literally, but that's a very tricky word, isn't it? What does the word literal mean? No one thinks the enemies of the people of God are literally beasts, right? They're not beasts. What do the beasts stand for? Well, the first and second beasts, I mean, I would argue, along with many, I don't think it's limited to this, but I think at least in its original historical context, the first beast stands for Rome, and the second beast, the imperial priesthood. Now, you may take those references differently, but they stand for something, don't they? They're not obviously they're not a literal beast. Satan isn't a literal dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns. Obviously, those are symbolic. And then I would argue in chapter 1, verse 4, in case I don't get to it, the 7 spirits of God, it refers to the Holy Spirit. But there's not 7 Holy Spirits, but 7 is the number of perfection, referring to the fullness of who the Spirit is. So obviously, sometimes interpreting those symbols is challenging and difficult, and we may disagree what they are. But everybody's interpreting symbols. You can't avoid that. No one just takes the book of Revelation literally. George Ladd, by the way, suggested some time ago, you know that name? He taught for many years at Fuller Seminary. George Ladd, who also has written a commentary on Revelation, he argues that when we talk about the genre of Revelation, we should put prophetic and apocalyptic together. Why not prophetic and apocalyptic? And of course, it's epistolary too. So we have those 3 genres. But we're thinking mainly here about apocalyptic. Why apocalyptic? It's often been pointed out that apocalyptic appeals to the imagination with its symbolic pictures and lurid images. And so I became a Christian. I grew up in a Catholic home, but I was not a believer. I became a Christian when I was 17 through the person who's now my wife. I'm not here to tell you my story today, but I first read Revelation when I was 17 years old, and I read it in the Living Bible. And I really got saved through reading the Living Bible. So I'm very grateful for the Living Bible. I know it has some deficiencies, of course. But anyway, I'll never forget reading the book of Revelation. You know, as a Catholic growing up, I never read the Bible. So I had no experience reading the Bible, and I was just amazed by the book. I realized immediately there's lots of things I don't understand in here. But I did get the big picture, right? Even in just we win, right? I got that out of the book right from the beginning, in this fascinating story, this apocalyptic meta narrative. Well, I'm just looking at the time here. I think I should go on to the second part. So my first chapter, that's just my introduction. I skipped some things, obviously, but my first chapter is titled The Deafness, right, in terms of hearing, the deafness of those living on earth. And so I just want to talk about some of the opponents here that are listed in the book. And the first opponents are the earth dwellers, right? Hoi kat oikuntes epe tes geis, if you know Greek, right? Literally, those who dwell upon the earth. So that's a technical term in Revelation for the opponents, those who dwell on the earth. The CSB, I'm the co-chair of the CSB. I'm a big fan of the CSB. Of course, I have to be, right? I worked on it a lot. Translated those who live on earth. And those who live on earth in Revelation, they belong to the beast. Revelation 3:10 says, only the earth dwellers will face the judgment that will engulf the entire world. And believers are going to be preserved. Of course, this brings up a theological issue. You know what I'm talking about. But I don't interpret that to mean that believers will be absent from the earth when the great trial arrives. Some people do. If you believe that, I love you. It means they won't face judgment. I think that it means that they'll be spared from God's wrath, just as Israel was exempted from the plagues that devastated Egypt, but Israel was still there. So the earth dwellers, they think they're living an ordinary life, buying, selling, marrying, and bearing. How are they living? They're just trying to get along in the world, surely, you know. So John's just describing people. But John tells us in chapter 17, verse 2, that those who live on earth have become drunk on the wine of her sexual immorality, and the her is Babylon. And the sexual immorality doesn't refer, so there's the picture, but the sexual immorality I don't think refers fundamentally to sexual sin per se, but drawing on the Old Testament, it refers to spiritual harlotry. So the fundamental sin of earth dwellers is idolatry. They worship another god besides the Lord. Just as in the Old Testament prophets declaimed against Israel, what? For its spiritual harlotry, right? For their whoredom. So the fundamental problem with earth dwellers, it's still true today, isn't it, right? Because earth dwellers are by definition unbelievers, I'll say more about that in a minute, is false worship. Their fundamental problem is they de-God God. That's their problem. So we read in chapter 13, verse 8, all those who live on the earth will worship the beast, everyone whose name was not written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who was slaughtered. So there's basically a definition of the earth dwellers, right? Everyone who lives on the earth worships the beast, everyone whose name's not written in the book of life. Well, obviously, John's not saying every single person on earth is going to hell, right? The earth dwellers are, it's a technical term for those who are, they're not thinking of the new creation. Earth dwellers, by definition, are unbelievers. Their names aren't written in the book of life, and therefore they worship. And they follow the beast. It's not as if earth dwellers fully realize the import of their actions, because we're told in chapter 13, verse 14, they're deceived in offering their worship to the beast. So, John's speaking apocalyptically, but sin, so I think this is a very good insight, right? Sin is marked by, I can remember when I was an unbeliever. I don't know if, some of you became Christians very young. But sin is marked by self-deception about who you are. And that's what's happening with the earth dwellers. They're self-deceived about themselves. As I said, they're just probably trying to get along in the world as it was. That's what I would have said about myself as an unbeliever. I'm just trying to live. Probably many of them thought they were virtuous and on the side of what was true and right and beautiful. And we can think of that of unbelievers today. What's their self-consciousness about what they're doing? So I don't think John is saying all these people are consciously against God. But John is giving an apocalyptic, transcendent, revelatory view of what's really happening. Because, we know unbelievers better than they know themselves, right? We have an insight into their lives through God's word. That's how we came to understand ourselves. Since earth dwellers give their worship to the beast and to the harlot, they oppose, chapter 11, verse 10, the proclamation of the gospel. The gospel is repugnant to them. They cast their lot, chapter 6, verse 10, chapter 11, verse 10 again, with those who put believers to death. Well, obviously, most people who lived on earth, even in John's day, had nothing to do with believers being put to death, right? They didn't. They were most people who were unbelievers had no role whatsoever. But again, John gives us a radical apocalyptic vision of reality. It's like the Gospel of John, which is, I think, one argument for why it's the same author. There's no neutral space out there. You're either light or darkness, right? You're in truth or error. You're from above or you're from below. You're from earth or you're from heaven. The earth dwellers are going to face judgment because they're on the wrong side of things. So they're the first opponents. Now I'm going to talk about the beast. So the beast is the terrifying earthly opponent, and he's christened the beast, isn't he, by John? He doesn't show up in the book till chapter 11, verse 7. And we're told there that he hails from the abyss, that's the underworld. He comes from the place of death and evil, doesn't he? In fact, we're told that what the beast does is he makes war on the saints and he puts them to death. And in chapter 13, we see a fuller introduction of the beast. And it's clear from chapter 12, verse 18, very powerful scene, right? Satan's standing on the beach, and he's looking out in the water, and out of the sea, and out of the sea comes that beast, right? So you get the sense of very, very powerful picture of him calling one of his henchmen to do his work. The language of the beast, right? We're told that it comes from Daniel 7, where the first beast is like a lion. Do you remember that? The second beast is like a bear. The third is like a leopard, and the fourth was indescribably horrible. And Daniel tells us in Daniel chapter 7, you have 4 beasts and 4 kingdoms. Everybody agrees that first kingdom is Babylon, whatever you do with the rest. Anyway, John sees the beast rising from the sea, and the sea isn't accidental, because the sea is a symbol of chaos, isn't it? The sea is a place of surging evil for John. In fact, the sea and the abyss, I'm not going to give you the text here, but the sea and the abyss are put together sometimes in the Old Testament. So they're not really that different. The beast is said to come from both, right? The beast is described as a lion, a bear, and a leopard. Well, those are the first 3 beasts in Daniel chapter 7, aren't they? So we have good reasons, I think, to believe that John understands this beast to be the 4th beast of Daniel 7. He has all the qualities of the other beasts are put together in this 4th and indescribably terrible beast. And this is apocalyptic, isn't it? Why does he describe it this way? To expose and unveil reality to us. So that what is John telling us? The empire, the Roman Empire, is not humane. It's not conducive to human flourishing. Instead, it's like a ravenous and ferocious beast which mauls, kills, and destroys human beings. I mean, Rome was extremely proud of its rule and government, but to borrow the language from 1 John, John describes its rule as the rule of the Antichrist, doesn't he? Richard Bauckham points out, I thought this was very interesting, because Revelation concentrates on the killing of Christians, but Bauckham points out in Revelation 18:24 that Rome is also criticized for trampling upon human rights and the dignity of human beings in general. It says that Rome is not just mistreating Christians, but it's also trampling on human rights of those who aren't Christian. So Rome is not only anti-God, it's anti-human in John's view. Even though Rome deprived people of their rights, their liberties, and even their lives, people stood in awe of the empire because of its unrivaled power. We've often seen this in history, haven't we? It's happened in our country. I'm not going to make political comments. People support those who are in power. That's a very tempting thing, even if they disapprove, even if the power is wielded unrighteously. The temptation to adore, and to worship the strong is almost irresistible, and we probably, I'm not taking it too far, but we've probably all done that to some extent in our lives, right? We've done something we thought was not right, but it was advantageous to us in some way. So Rome could claim that it was on the right side of history. The power of Rome is evident in the wound which the beast suffered. Now, this is a very controversial passage, and, this is where I am on it right now. The wound that is healed is a parody of the resurrection, right? It looks like the beast is dying, and it comes back to life. And most interpreters think that's talking about this legend and myth about Nero, being put to death and coming back. There was a great fear that Nero, who was a very terrible emperor, right, was going to come back. Of course, that never happened. And maybe, by the way, I gave one of these lectures out in the Northeast, and Eckhart Schnabel, if you know him, a New Testament scholar, Eckhart didn't agree with me on this because he thinks it is Nero, and maybe that's right. And, whenever Eckhart disagrees with me, I think maybe I'm probably wrong. Eckhart Schnabel disagrees with me. But I still lean towards this. I'm closer to Greg Beale here, I think, that actually Don Carson, that this is symbolizing that it looks like the empire is going to lose its power and then it rises from the ashes again. When you think the empire is coming to an end. Chapter 17, chapter 17 is an extremely difficult chapter where we read about the beast who was and is not and is about to come. And I can even see from the time I have, maybe I'm not going to get into that right now if you want to ask a question about it, but I interpret that symbolically too. I don't interpret that in terms of 7 emperors. If you know Revelation, where do you start? Do you start with Caesar? Do you start with Augustus? Do you skip some of those emperors about 68 and 69? Or empires, I read it with Castor and many others as just more symbolic. That's maybe that's the hardest. Those are the hardest verses in the book. However we parse out the details there, the resurrection of the beast, or his coming in the future, leads people to worship. Because in the estimation of the people, the beast is incomparable. Like God is incomparable. People say, who is like the beast? This is 13:4. Who is able to wage war against it? The incomparability of the beast. The beast is radically narcissistic and self-obsessed. It boasts of its exploits and it reviles the one true God, Revelation 13:5. It has a totalitarian impulse, doesn't it? It translates into rage against the one and only true God and his people. Like all megalomaniacs, it doesn't merely elicit worship, but demands and enforces homage, 13:12. It demands it. Earth dwellers give it that homage. We already saw that. Political, economic, and bureaucratic pressure is put on believers to give adulation to the beast. I'll say more about that in a minute. When they refuse to capitulate, they face economic discrimination, and they're even put to death. Well, a little bit about 666. How do I understand that? Here I do follow Greg Beale. Again, that's a very difficult issue. Again, many people think it's Nero. I tend to think 777 is the perfect number. 666 indicates that which is inferior. So I don't connect it with a particular individual, but it's a representation of what is evil. But maybe it's Nero. Maybe I'll come clearer on this as if I get a chance to keep working on this book. Here I want to read something that Petirim Sorokin wrote. He's a Russian sociologist. I think he describes well the society which develops under totalitarian rules, a little bit of application. Inalienable rights will be alienated. Declarations of rights either abolished or used only as beautiful screens for an unadulterated coercion. Governments will become more and more hoary, fraudulent, and tyrannical, giving bombs instead of bread, death instead of freedom, violence instead of law. Security will fade, the population will become weary and scared. Suicide, mental disease, and crime will grow. So I think John teaches that the rule of the beast continues to manifest itself in human history. If there are periods of history where it looks like the beast is dead, it arises from the ashes again. That's my argument. So it's not just limited to Rome, but the beast appears again and again. So, Francis Fukuyama said it was the end of history. I never read that essay, but I read about it. He's been panned for that. Well, 1989, we all see. In 2019, it definitely wasn't the end of history and the blossoming of the new era, right? Now the second beast, a quick word about the second beast. He's the sidekick of the first, 13:11 through 18. He has the same destructive and ravaging character. Elsewhere in chapter 16 and 19 and 20, he's described as the false prophet. The second beast has a religious and prophetic dimension, showing that political power is intertwined with religious devotion. So there's no separation here of church and state, is there? And historically, I agree with those who say that the reference is to the imperial cult. The second beast parodies Christ, since he has two horns like a lamb. And he, as a false prophet, he deceives those. Here's that sin of self-deception again, chapter 13, right? He deceives those who worship the beast and receive its image by performing spectacular signs that dazzle observers. Deuteronomy 13. I'm sure you're familiar with that text. I won't read the whole thing, but Deuteronomy 13 is a very interesting text. I actually think the Pharisees probably used it against Jesus, because Deuteronomy 13 says what you can do. A prophet can do a sign or wonder, or predict a sign or wonder, and it comes true, and the Lord is testing you to see if you really love the Lord. So you can see how the Pharisees could have said that about Jesus. Yes, these signs and wonders are coming true, but Jesus is telling us not to follow the Lord. He's a false prophet. Obviously, they were wrong, weren't they? But this would fit very well the false prophet, wouldn't it? He's able to do signs and wonders and miracles. But the Lord, Deuteronomy 13, is testing his people. So we see again the role of apocalyptic revelation. The evidence. See, what's the evidence? Signs, wonders, and miracles are happening. The evidence seems to attest the validity of the message proclaimed by the false prophet. His miracles are coming true, apparently. But evidence must always be interpreted within the matrix of divine revelation, particularly in light of the truth that one must only worship the one true God. And so what we have here is the totalitarian and coercive nature of the power exercised by the two beasts. We do not find a live and let live world. Instead, the second beast discriminates against those who don't prostrate themselves before the beast. Political tyranny, economic discrimination, religious persecution mark the rule of the two beasts. Now, a quick word on Babylon, and then I'm going to say something about Satan. The jealous competitor of the bride of the Lamb. So the end of the book is right, the vision of the two women, Babylon and the bride, the wife of the Lamb. Obviously, the moniker Babylon is symbolic. Virtually no commentator thinks that John refers to Babylon literally. The name stirs up memory of many Old Testament antecedents, obviously, from Genesis 11 on. I think the most natural way of reading Revelation, he tells us it's the woman sits on 7 mountains, and it's the great city that has royal power over the kings of the earth. So I agree with those who say the city is Rome. I don't agree with those who think the city is Jerusalem. It's Rome, the capital city of the empire. But I think Augustine basically got this right in saying there's a city of man and city of God. It continues on in history. So you could say there's a sense in which our major cities are Babylon, right? That doesn't mean there aren't some righteous people in the cities, because of course there are Christians in Rome, right? To the human eye, Rome was prosperous, rich, entrancing, exciting, and beautiful, dressed in purple, scarlet, and adorned with gold, jewels, and pearls, 17:4. A city pulsating with business and commerce, with entrepreneurs hawking their wares. Yeah, last night I took a little walk from where my hotel is, and I ended up in this mall. And wow, I thought this is a small little mall, but it was not small. And all kinds of beautiful things in there. Still, the city, like the beast, is a mystery, 17:7. And John unveils for readers the true nature of the city. The city bustles with business and promises prosperity, but in reality, the city is a wicked prostitute. I think that's the unveiling of the mystery. Here's what Bauckham says. At first glance, she might seem to be the goddess Roma in all her glory, a stunning personification of the civilization of Rome, as she was worshipped in many a temple in the cities of Asia. But as John sees her, she is a Roman prostitute, a seductive whore, and a scheming witch, and her wealth and splendor represent the profits of her disreputable trade. So Babylon, John says, it's the engine of economic oppression. And the earth dwellers, well, they've gotten into bed with her. and they're engaging in sexual immorality, by which I mean idolatry. Paul says true worship consists of glorifying God and giving him thanks, Romans 1:21. But Babylon glorifies itself and lives for its own comfort, Revelation 18:7. Furthermore, she thinks she is unassailable in her rule, convinced that grief and sorrow will never be her portion since she is queen, 18:7. Focus is here on her idolatry. She's the mother of prostitutes. So the woman Babylon may look stunning and beautiful, but she is actually demonic and unclean, 18:2. Despite her material prosperity, Babylon was a shopper's paradise where goods from the farthest reaches of the world were available. We can't help but think of the prosperity of our culture. It's just astonishing. The city was filled with astonishingly gifted musicians, gifted craftsmen of every trade, the best and tastiest food, and technological wizardry. This is 18:22 and 23. But at the same time, its prosperity was gained unjustly, even enslaving other human beings to support her lavish lifestyle. Babylon's oppression doesn't end there, but climaxes in the martyrdom of the saints. She's depicted as a disgusting drunk who's drunk. You know, the blood of the saints is on Babylon's lips. Again, that's the apocalyptic perspective, because most believers weren't being put to death, right? We're only talking about probably sporadic deaths here and there. But one thing I do want to say is something I always say in my classes when I teach Revelation. I said, you know, if 5 believers, Kentucky's what? Population here, I don't even know it is huge, right, in California. But Kentucky, what? We're 4 or 5 million, small population. But if 5 believers were put to death last year, they'd get our attention, right? I mean, no believers, as far as we know, because they were believers, were put to death in Kentucky last year, or anywhere in the United States that I'm aware of. But, you know, if even a few are being put to death, it would have a tremendous impact on us, wouldn't it? Anyway, the dragon. Unsuspecting readers might be surprised to learn that the most common word for the devil in Revelation is the word dragon. That's 13 times. Satan is found 8 times, devil 5 times, serpent 4 times. The selection of the appellation dragon fits with the apocalyptic character of the book. For the enemy of the people of God is described in mythological terms as a monster who exercises a preternatural power over human beings. I'm not saying he's mythological. I'm saying he's described in mythological terms, right? I believe in Satan, okay? Just in case you said, wait a minute, that sounded funny. So that, you know, goes back to the Old Testament, to Leviathan, Rahab, and Tanin, so forth and so on. The term Satan means adversary, and it designates Satan's influence on others. Twice the Jews are identified as the synagogue of Satan, 2:9 and 3:9. Now, John is not anti-Semitic. He's Jewish himself. We ought not to read that as an anti-Semitic comment. John is just telling us, I think, something that was happening probably in the Jewish synagogues of Smyrna and Philadelphia. The Jews turned against the Christians, and they probably reported them to imperial authorities. You know, in the next century, that's exactly what happened in the martyrdom of Polycarp. The Jews reported Polycarp to the imperial authorities, saying he was not willing to offer sacrifice or worship the emperor. Probably for the Jews, it was a matter of self-protection, right? They wanted to distance themselves from the Christian. But John tells us that that's a satanic thing. They're actually not on God's side. In 2:13, Pergamon is described as the place where Satan's throne is, and most scholars agree here that we have a reference to the imperial cult, where there was a worship of the emperor in Pergamon. And this is influencing the churches, isn't it? He speaks of Jezebel's influence in 2:20. Obviously, that's not a real name. A prophetess. And the danger for the Christians, they're tempted to compromise, right? That's what Jezebel was doing. eating food offered to idols and engaging in sexual immorality, which may be idolatry. Probably it's both, sexual sin and idolatry. The word devil, we find the word devil 5 times, chapter 2, chapter 12, chapter 20. That word means slanderer. And what does the devil do? In chapter 12, verse 10, he accuses the people of God, which we find elsewhere in Scripture, don't we, where that's the devil's role of accusing us. And he deceives, chapter 12, verse 9, chapter 20, verse 10, he deceives people about the truth. He's characterized as full of fury and irrational anger towards God and his people, 12:12. So evil, right? Satan is absolutely brilliant, far smarter than any of us. But evil at the end of the day, I'm not speaking clinically here, evil is insanity, right? He's full of insane anger towards the things of God. That fury manifests itself in persecution, but he uses his human agents, doesn't he? As the serpent. The dragon's 7 heads and 10 horns symbolize his authority and his strength. He sweeps away 1/3 of the stars of heaven. That's chapter 12, verse 4. That goes back to Daniel chapter 8, verse 10. I interpret that, some people interpret that as the angels who went with him, but I interpret that to refer to the persecution of the saints. Because I think in Daniel chapter 8, verse 10, it's not referring to demons there. So believers are described there as stars, right? Who are persecuted. That's what Antiochus Epiphanes did. Of course, that verse is disputed. Anyway, in chapter 12, I'll talk about this more Wednesday. Yeah, today's Monday, isn't it? Wednesday. The dragon's cast out of heaven, and he knows his time to wage war is short. It's abbreviated, and thus he pursues the woman. Now, so I interpret, this is very disputed, I don't have time to defend it here, but I interpret the 3.5 years, the 1,260 days, and the 42 months, all to refer to the time between the cross and the second coming, or the resurrection and the second coming. So I argue we're in those 42 months now. You know, some of you probably disagree with that. But if I'm right, the interesting thing about it is what Revelation is talking about relates to us today. It isn't just something that happens at the end of history, but he's talking about our lives and what we face as believers. And so what is Satan doing? The short time is the time from the resurrection to the second coming. And, you know, it's insane, right? You know you've lost, but you fight anyway. That's insane. But Satan's insane, isn't he? He just wants to bring down all with him that he can. He tries to destroy the people of God with a flood. Do you remember that in chapter 12? Well, I don't think it's a literal flood. I think he's talking about every means he can use to destroy the people of God. And that would include false teaching, persecution, inciting people to wicked behavior, and so forth and so on. And we have the Trinity, don't we? We have the false Trinity. We have Satan, and then his henchmen, the two beasts. They work together. And so this is, I've basically come to the end. Let me just read my conclusion. Life on earth may look ordinary and even plebeian. Maybe it feels ordinary to you today. It feels pretty ordinary to me today. But John reminds the readers that there is a war on a cosmic conflict, a great battle between good and evil and between God and Satan. Behind the opposition which comes from the two beasts, Babylon and the earth dwellers, is the great dragon himself, the ancient serpent, the great adversary and accuser and slanderer of God's people. Just as he tempted Eve, so too he is attempting to intimidate and to terrify the saints so that they depart from God. So that's very practical, isn't it? The Roman Empire and Roman religion in the great city of Rome are not neutral entities. They've thrown their lot in with the dragon. Thus, what is happening on earth is not trivial or insignificant. Believers must hear the message so that they truly grasp what is going on in the world, and so that they persevere until the end. That's my next chapter, which I'm not going to do. Unbelievers who are on earth, whom John calls the earth dwellers, are an earthly instead of a heavenly people. John, in apocalyptic colors, draws the line for his readers. One is either on the side of the earth dwellers, the beast, Babylon, and Satan, or one belongs to God. There's no neutral space. Either one hears the message proclaimed by the Lord, or one is deaf to the things of God. John writes so that his readers will hear and see what is at stake, to wake them up, so that they will be wise instead of foolish, devoted to God instead of to the dragon. The message for us today, at least one message, is that we should not put our trust in political power to bring in the kingdom. This doesn't mean, of course, that Christians should forsake the political sphere, for we are called upon to engage the culture and to do good in every sphere. But Revelation warns us about utopian dreams of bringing in the kingdom through political dreams. Indeed, as believers, we must be alert, since the rulers of this world incline toward totalitarianism. Obviously, there's exceptions in history, aren't there? Government may gobble up human rights in the name of justice, and Christians may find themselves in this situation described by John, where they face discrimination in employment, where they are persecuted and are even put to death. And of course, some of our brothers and sisters are facing that in other parts of the world today, aren't they? Such economic and political discrimination opens up the temptation to compromise with the world. And John warns believers about this mortal danger, which we will consider further in other lectures. Thank you so much. Yeah.